All right, morning, y'all. So fair warning, this is kind of half-baked. It came about via a couple of conversations that I had here yesterday. And so when the call for lightning talks was put out, I was like, yeah, I like lightning. So bear with me. So wanted to talk about this concept of security without a security team. I'm curious, who here works at a company that doesn't have a security team, if you're willing to admit it? Okay, so actually very few. So just stating my own bias before I get started, I know there are a lot of permutations that this can take, whether it's an early stage startup that just doesn't have a security program yet, or a large legacy organization that doesn't really have a security team, or a nonprofit that doesn't have the budget for it. And also, a lot of you who've been in the space for a while probably worked in security functions before security teams were common. So my own purview is mostly the former, the early stage stuff that will eventually probably have a security team. But I just want to get that out of the way that my perspective is just one among many. So scarcity has a way of making people really resourceful. So I wanted to kind of keep that in mind, that even if you don't have a really robust security program yet, there are ways to sort of build those first things. And why is this even important when a company is just starting out? So the need for customer trust often predates having much of a security budget at all. So you need to still be able to say with some confidence, even if it's not high confidence, that you're taking measures to not get yourself pwned and therefore not get your customers pwned. So how do you do that? So a few things get tossed around a lot. One of them is just reinforcing good behavior and building good security habits. And this makes sense when you don't have much of a budget, because when you don't have money for fancy tooling, fancy detection tooling, and a lot of staff who can be detecting stuff, responding to stuff, pushing for good application security, you have your people at least. You still have the relationships you form. This comes with some limitations, though. One is that regardless, your security culture is going to be a reflection of your larger culture. And so if you're not thinking about organizational culture as a whole when your organization is really small, suddenly you're going to be 200 people and look behind you and realize that you still had whatever culture you had when you were 50 people. So if you aren't necessarily thinking just in terms of how can I build a positive security culture, but rather how can I have a wider organizational culture that is built upon blamelessness, transparency, collaboration, you're going to lay the groundwork for a good security culture when that staffing time comes. There's also the aspect of that, skip too fast. Bad security education can lead to a loss of credibility. So if you are kind of just haphazardly throwing stuff out there when you need to have security staff and when you need to have that buy-in, it's not necessarily going to be there. I would rather have no security onboarding than having people watch a shitty Kevin Mitnick video that's full of FUD. So you've got to think about your words matter, your tone matters, and you're setting the tone that might come back to bite you later on. But most of all, scarcity makes people extremely tired and really stressed out. And startup environments a lot of times are just kind of chaotic, and everyone's trying to put on their own oxygen masks first. And so people's ability to make good decisions and retain new information and reinforce good habits goes way down when they're stressed out. And while I don't want to perpetuate a culture of constant burnout, a lot of times it's the reality that startups move really quickly. There's a constant influx of new information. You're basically having to reinvent your job every few months. And so it's really difficult to be intentional about constantly reinforcing good behavior. So how do we take some of that decision-making out of it when you need to make a decision about security that's in your best interest? So look for ways within what you already have to make security the default. So this can take a few different forms. With the technology around you, think about what attack surface you have and how you can reduce that. I'm a big fan of Chromebooks just because for a lot of roles, you don't necessarily need a full operating system, and when you have basically just a web browser, that's a lot less attack surface. I like to say MFA all the things, but if you can't MFA all the things or enforce MFA on all the things, pick a few really high-impact things that you can enforce MFA on, like email, and oftentimes that spreads wider, because even if you don't have single sign-on, if G Suite's your provider, then OAuth is probably going to be a thing that people use just on their own. Think about enforcing MFA on your source code repository or AWS. Just pick a few. And even if you can't afford to buy people YubiKeys, most authenticator apps are free or have a free version. So things like that, things about using what you already have and taking the security decision out of it for people by just making that the norm. So use what's already available to you, even if you're not necessarily buying a lot of stuff. Things like, if you're using GitHub or a lot of other CI/CD tools, have some sort of security functionality built in some way, like GitHub will notify you when a component of one of your repos has a vulnerability associated with it, so then you can patch it. If you're using Gmail as your email provider, they're actually pretty decent about detecting phishing. So even if you don't have a security team to report potential phishing emails to, you've got a way of at least sort of marking it as spam so that G Suite detects it. So you can also, I skipped over a section. I also wanted to call out password hygiene is really important. So even if you don't have like an enforced password manager thing, when somebody is onboarding, even if there's not a checklist yet, you can just they usually have a bunch of accounts to set up. Not that difficult to say, by the way, here's LastPass, add that too. I'd also say beyond the existing technology you have, use the people that are available to you and see how they can become a tiny security advocate in some way, even if they're not constantly being your security champion. If you have an SRE and that's ingesting alerts, see if they can add some security alerts onto that, just so that you're ingesting that data, even if you don't necessarily have a robust incident response process yet. If you have engineers, they might already be doing some sort of code review and testing. If you have an HR person, they might be doing some sort of onboarding of new hires where they're setting some basic expectations. So if you're adding in a couple of basic security expectations, like we're going to enforce multi-factor authentication on these few accounts. If you don't know what that is, go here to learn more. If you have a CFO or somebody handling finance, have them keep an eye on your AWS bill for any spikes in usage. A lot of times that's how those miners and other things are detected, is just we had a spike in cost this month. Sorry? Oh, sorry. That was just, I wasn't sure if I missed a comment. So things like that. The underlying thing is use what's already available to you rather than focusing so much on what you don't have yet. You'll get there, or maybe you won't, but there are ways to do it without necessarily having a huge security budget yet. So to end on sort of a positive note, having no security team does present some challenges, but it also kind of distributes the need for ownership a little bit. So I like to say during new hire onboarding training in my last role, we're all the security team. But when there is no security team, that really does change, and we are all the security team.